Please welcome Jason Locy.
So clearly it's been, 6 years since I had a headshot. I was thinking all night about how long I had to endure that introduction, and it proved exactly what I thought it would be. But thank you. This is my second time here. And I was eating last night with Paul and some other folks, and I was reminded of how sweet the time here is and what a unique thing you guys have. I don't know if you recognize how unique it is, but it is. And so I'm thankful for you, and I'm thankful to be here, and thankful to share a little bit about what I've been thinking about lately. I come to you from the land of Kings in Brooklyn, and as was mentioned, I have 4 kids there. We live in an apartment about the size of this music stand, and and I have a design studio in that we office out of Manhattan. And so prior to that, I lived in Atlanta for about 13 years. So massive cultural shock, massive adjustment to space. My kids, I was telling Paul, my kids have vocabulary, a cursing vocabulary of a sailor, 40-year veteran in the Navy. Luckily, they don't exercise it, but they know them all. I was telling him, they asked me the other day, what does such and such mean? I was like, I don't know. And they said, Google it, Dad. I was like, I'm not Googling that. So I'm going to take the next little bit here and share with you guys a couple things that have been going on with me. I actually wasn't going to talk about some of this, and it's not a big deal, but being with the men last night and this morning, I think there's a couple other ideas that maybe connect to what I'm talking about. And I usually am pretty prescriptive with what I write down, because what will happen is if I talk by myself for more than 2.5 minutes, I say something really stupid. So we'll see what happens as all of this comes out, and we'll just trust that there's grace if I say something ridiculous. But I turned 40 earlier this year, and I know I look, with my gray beard, balding hair, and cardigan, I look 55, but I'm only 40, and it was sort of like it was okay. I like it. I like being older. I live in a place where the medium age has to be 24 or something. We might literally be the oldest people in our church, my wife and I. Our oldest son is the oldest, and so I've kind of owned this idea that I can cut in line places and people don't care, and because I'm old, and the beard, this helps me keep my seat on the subway. I don't have to stand up as much, and I don't mind it. But I've been thinking through this idea of coherence in my life, and wanting things to all sort of connect as it relates to how the gospel is expressed through me and how it's impacted my life. And it's sort of a hard thing to wrestle with, coherence. Wanting to have all facets of your life be impacted by the gospel, but know that not all of them are, because you're human and you can't possibly figure it all out yet. I was on a work photo shoot last week, and we have a client that goes into bottom 5% schools in the country and helps turn them around. And we go once a year and we take photos of the kids. And I'm sitting there, and it occurred to me that I was wearing socks from Target that were likely made by children in Indonesia or somewhere, in the same economic plight as the kids we were taking a photo of. And I was completely bothered by it, this lack of coherence with something as simple as my sock, and trying to help these kids. And so these thoughts have been sort of plaguing my mind lately. And I'm reading this book called The Middle Passage. And right at the beginning, he plants this question: who am I apart from my history and the roles I have played? Who am I apart from my history and the roles I have played? I've always thought of myself in the context of the things that have happened to me, the experiences that I've had, the relationships that I've had, the things that I've known and I've done. And when you strip all of those things away and you start thinking about who are you, it's a really bothersome question, to be frank. And of course, we have our identity in Christ, and I recognize that in the abstract. But in the concrete vacuum of wrestling with this thing in my mind, it's been a really perplexing question. So as I think about that question, who am I apart from my history and the roles I have played, I have to think about my history, and I have to think about the parts that I've played. I have to think about all of these orbiting ideas. And so I was sharing last night, there's sort of been a couple themes in my life. One theme I was prepared to share, and the other two I'll just give you a sort of passing glimpse at, or maybe there's three, we'll see, I don't know. Sometimes four come out, sometimes three come out. I don't know what'll come out to this morning, but at least three. My wife and I grew up in Virginia, and the great Commonwealth, and went to school there, and got married there, and stayed there. It's very unhealthy if you're ever thinking about that. You should probably leave and cleave and get out of town. But I stayed there, and we had an opportunity to move to Atlanta, Georgia, with a job that I had at the time, and my wife was pregnant. And we thought, you know what, if we're going to move, this is a good time to move. It was a good job. So we moved down there, and this was in 2001. We were pregnant with our first son, and things were going great. Work was okay. I don't know that I was completely sort of satisfied in my job, but it paid well, and I wasn't willing to kind of move from that. I was saying last night, I grew up in a situation where my dad was a musician, or I don't know if he's a musician, but he was a music theorist and a professor and a conductor. And he said, you can do anything, just don't go into music. And so I had this sort of mindset that like you went to school, you got a job, and you made money, and that was sort of like your professional context and calling. So I was in this situation. I don't know how satisfied I was. I wasn't very much, but I wasn't going to leave because it paid well, and that's what you did. On September 11th, 2001, my wife goes into labor, and we have our first son. 2 days later, I lose that job. And so we had committed to my wife staying home, and we had a newborn. And, I'm 40 now, and I'm still not super great with money, but I was awful with it then, so we had no savings. And we were in this really sort of dark situation. So that's sort of one thing. The second thing is we had that son. His name's Ethan. We had another son. His name is Christian. And one day my wife comes to me and says, I think we should have 3, and I think we should adopt. And I was like, good grief, woman. Enough is enough. And so I was never really opposed to adoption so much, but my capacity to love was tapped. And I just did not think that we could handle 3 kids. And so she said, well, I'm going to pray for you that God will change your heart. And if your wife ever says that to you, you should look out, because whatever she says is going to happen is probably going to happen. And it did, and we adopted a beautiful girl named Naomi. And then we adopted, again, the 4th time, a daughter named Eliana. So we had 4 beautiful children. Yes.
We just had a granddaughter named Eliana.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So that was the second thread. The third thread is that when we were living in Atlanta, we were really sort of we wanted to move, and we didn't want to be there. And we lived in a wonderful neighborhood. We lived in suburban Mecca. I mean, this was the place you go to if you want to have 3 swimming pools, multiple tennis courts, a golf course. I don't do any of these things, by the way. But like, if you're going to live in suburbia, you need to live in suburbia. You just own it. And we had this wonderful home. Our home in Atlanta has more bathrooms than our apartment has bedrooms in Brooklyn. And we had this really great situation, and God was really blessing us. And we just hated it. We did not like it. And we felt like we needed to move. And what we realized was that we didn't need to move necessarily. We needed to learn how to be content with what we had. And so we wrestled for 2 years, maybe 3, with just praying through being content, being satisfied with where we are and having joy in that. And at the end of that period, we felt okay where we were, and we felt comfortable. And then a year later, we just felt this complete calm and peace that God was saying, your time's here done. Your time here is done. For whatever reason you were here, why I had you here, that's happened. Move on. You have complete freedom now to think about this. And so we ended up in Brooklyn. And so as I think about this question, who am I apart from my history and the roles I have played, I come back to those three ideas because I think they've defined at least the second part of my life in a pretty profound way. When I think about my son being born, and I think about the period we went through when I lost my job, and I wasn't happy in my old job, but I wasn't going to leave, I realized that sometimes God nudges you into places, and sometimes he just kicks you in the ass really, really hard and makes you go where he wants you. And the nudging is way better. And so when I think about moving and being content in Atlanta, I realized God was nudging us. And I think had we just moved before being content, we might have had a swift kick coming. And so I'm grateful for the lesson that I learned upon losing my job. And when I think about our adoptions, I recognize that I have, because of Christ, because of the love we have in that he gave us, I have unlimited capacity to love. I'm just so selfish sometimes that I don't allow it to kind of seep out. And so those are three sort of narratives that have defined the second part of my life, from, call it, age 25 to age 40. But there's another part of my life that was defined from, call it, age 7 to age right now. And it's the idea of forgiveness, and it's this idea that we all have pains and we all have struggles, and those things have the ability to keep us back. They have the ability to keep us from loving others. They have the ability to keep us from recognize when we're being nudged. And in my life, at least, it was a very bitter sort of place of not forgiving. And so that's really what I wanted to talk about today, was forgiveness. So I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes, 20, talking about that. And to be frank, forgiveness is not an easy concept for me to talk about. I'm not good at it. Maybe that's why I like to talk about it, because it forces me to think about it. Just yesterday, I was leaving, not to come here, but I was leaving to go somewhere, and my wife and I were arguing, and she told me to shut up and leave, and I did, and I thought, well, good luck with the forgiveness talk tomorrow. So talking about it forces you to forgive people because you don't want to get up here and be a total jerk about it. So I worked in a, but it's a, forgiveness is not an easy thing to wrestle with. Even forgiving, hearing Mitch, like the idea of maybe even forgiving yourself, let alone forgiving others people, is completely a foreign idea, even socially and culturally and in our own hearts. I worked at an optical store when I was in college, and I would help fit people for glasses. And they would always come back the next day if they hadn't worn glasses before and complain about headaches and they couldn't see and it was wrong and the doctor screwed up. And it was a pretty crappy store, and so he had sometimes, but a lot of times it was this idea that they just weren't used to seeing things properly. And as the body and the eye and the brain sort of adjusted to seeing things in the proper perspective, it felt painful. And I think forgiveness feels like that sometimes. Your body, your inner body, your soul, and your mind and your heart begin to reorient themselves. And it's so foreign and different than the way that it felt before that it feels off and it feels wrong and it feels painful and hurtful. But I think that is just sort of the idea of the heart correcting itself. But it makes it harder to enter into the idea of forgiveness. And then the second thing, I struggle with forgiveness because it's an incredibly personal thing. I don't like to forgive. I would rather have my bad glasses on, right? And I would rather not have to deal with it. But I had a pastor once, and he said, if you don't confront it, and if you don't talk to other people about what's going on in your life, you're robbing others of seeing grace. And so, with those ideas, I've started to kind of get my head not around how to forgive so much, but around some lessons that I've learned in trying to forgive. I grew up in Virginia, as I mentioned before, and we lived basically in, what would it be? Like, I lived near a town called Lynchburg, which has, about as many people as in this room. And, huh? Oh yeah, awesome. Okay, so you know what it's like. So I lived on the outskirts of this place, so there was nothing happening where I grew up, and it was called Good. That was the name of the town, and there was this, it was just this barbed wire fencing and tall grass and places to run around. It was kind of a great place to grow up. Not necessarily where you want to live as a grown-up, but it was awesome, until you're about 15. But growing up there, we had this sort of quintessential Southern upbringing, shirts off, in the woods all day, playing in the creek, playing G.I. Joe was the thing when I was growing up, so we were killing Cobra Commanders, and we were hiding in tree forts and covering ourselves in mud, and eventually someone's mom would yell, "Come home," and we would ignore them, and then we would hang out, and then they would call again and again and again, and we finally end up home. And this was my day, like over and over and over again. It was fantastic, and I really loved it. My dad built the house that we grew up in, and it was this sort of stone and brick house. And I remember going out and playing in the rocks as he was working on stuff. I would kind of contribute in my own little way. And the house was arranged. It was like a ranch, and so the house was arranged that my room was in the back, and across from it was my parents' room. We had this weird habit of not closing our doors when we went to sleep at night. I don't know where that was established, but we all kept our doors open. And so, or maybe that's not weird. I don't know. Maybe everyone does that. But I could hear my parents talk at night, and I could hear them, if it woke me up, I could hear them sort of recounting the day, and, Aunt Libby was doing this, and Uncle Wade did this, and my brother's Josh, how are we going to get Josh over to here, and what's Jason's thing with this? And, I kind of eavesdropped and kept up with the family business, so to speak. And so one morning, I was about 7 years old, and I'm laying in bed, and by morning, I mean, 1 in the morning. And the phone rings, and I'm awakened by it. And I catch my parents' side of the conversation, and in essence, what is happening is a man is threatening to come over and shoot my dad and kill him because he was having an affair with this guy's wife. And so, as you can imagine, as 7 years old, it's an incredibly disturbing thing to hear in the middle of the night. Probably be disturbing now, actually, but at 7, it was pretty off the charts thing to hear. And I just laid in bed and I listened to my mom cry, and I listened to my dad try to diffuse this situation. And over the course of what felt like 3 hours, they were able to calm this guy down and hang up the phone. I woke up the next morning and I didn't say a word about it, and I kept it to myself for, the better part of my life. Things just sort of went back to this really awkward normal. In fact, the next day it was raining. My dad went outside and mowed the grass, and I took my brother in the back room and just played with him. And so we had this sort of surreal, awkward day happening, but again, didn't say anything. I don't know how many times that little story played out in our house, but it was frequent. Not maybe to that extent, but adultery was a large part of my parents' marriage. And I never said anything about it. And the reason I didn't say anything about it is because a couple reasons. One, I was really embarrassed. We lived in a really small town. We lived in a town that was super religious in nature. There was a large church there. My dad was a professor at the Christian university. He was the orchestra director at the large church in the town. He directed the choir, and he was actually a really awesome dad. He was fantastic. He coached all my Little League stuff. He was fun. He was funny, and he still is in his old man ways. And in the South, to say that your dad's cheating on your mom at this church, it just was not okay. Divorce was not a thing people did, and the kids whose parents were divorced, they weren't Christians, or they were, we felt bad for them, and we kind of talked about them behind their back. So there was this embarrassment and shame that came with it. The other thing was it really sort of impacted me at a core level in a way that I didn't recognize at the time. I had this unbelievably difficult time trusting others. I couldn't open up to my parents because I was always in this situation where, like, well, what if my dad is having an affair right now with a woman? And by the way, I didn't totally connect that you have sex when you have an affair. I was a little guy. thought they went and ate ice cream or whatever. And then I figured it out later, trust me. But my assumption was that they would get together and they would talk. And what else would you talk about but me? Because I'm awesome. And so I realize now that they probably weren't talking a whole lot, but I had this idea in my mind that if I shared stuff with my dad, he would share it with this other woman, and I didn't want this other woman knowing anything about me because it was a horrible invasion into my privacy and to my being. As a result, I kept everything sort of bottled up. I didn't share real feelings. I didn't share real thoughts. I didn't share anything below sort of like the surface idea of whatever I was dealing with. And so, as you can imagine, that makes relationships incredibly difficult. If you're not very open with people, it's hard to get into deep friendships, and it's hard to date past a couple weeks and all of these things. Great couple weeks, but after that. And then I had this other sort of thing where I was completely scared of repeating my dad's mistakes. So instead of I don't know, there was just something about the Locy narrative that had adultery baked into it, from my dad to his dad and other uncles and things like that. And I didn't want to do that. And so instead of focusing on Christ, I just kept focusing on not doing the thing that I didn't want to do, which obviously amplifies it in your mind, and it becomes this crazy thing that you can't seemingly avoid. Luckily, through God's grace, I have thus far been fine, but only after I shifted my focus on not doing it to seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and kind of changing the way my outlook was on this situation. So at some point, I kind of couldn't take it anymore, and in a really awkward sort of, my parents are watching, I don't know, Simon and Simon or whatever is on the TV at the time, and I walk down, it's like, hey, I know. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm just trying to watch TV. I kind of say, like, I heard this phone call, I knew what was going on, it just kind of like all came out. And without missing a beat, my dad just says, yes, it was an isolated thing, we've worked through it, and I'm really sorry. And I know for a fact that there has been multiple affairs. And so everything I thought about, every reason I had for not telling him was reinforced in that moment. You can't trust people. You can't share their feelings. They're just going to tell you what they need to tell you to get out of the situation that they're in. And so I really didn't say much about it after that to him. I told my wife before we got married, and just kind of continued living in the shame of this whole thing. And so the first thing I learned, my first point is this, and this is really cheesy, but it helps me. The rest of the points won't be as cheesy, so don't get excited. Doing no thing is actually doing something, and it's the wrong thing. Here's what I've come to discover about forgiveness. I mentioned I grew up in Virginia. My grandmother was from Virginia as well, and she grew up on a tobacco farm. And from the time she was 3 years old, they had her out picking the worms off of the tobacco leaves. And I was thinking about this idea of farming and how it's sort of rooted in my narrative and how it's sort of in me. Even though I couldn't farm my way out of a paper bag, there's something in there that calls me to the land. I don't want to work it, but it would be nice if, hired help, made it happen. I could have a lake and, that sounds nice. But there's something about it that is attractive to me. So I started thinking about farming and what it is. And the interesting thing about farming, in my limited knowledge of it, is there's certain things you can do, right? Like you plant the seed, you pull the weeds, you tend the crop. But if it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain. And so there's this very active and passive relationship that happens in farming, in that you tend to the soil, you do all of the things that you're supposed to do, and then you wait for the rain. And I think forgiveness looks a lot like that. You have to begin to work at it, and you have to begin to cultivate the land, and then you kind of just have to wait and let God do his business. And maybe that'll happen tomorrow. Maybe it'll happen over 10 years. And maybe it won't happen. I don't know. But I know that we have to work at it, and I know that there's only so much that we can do. and then God takes over. And I'm faithful in that. I'm faithful in the idea that God constantly softens my heart towards my dad, and that I'm in this perpetual motion of forgiveness towards my situation. And by the way, I know that people in this room have been hurt in profound ways. And I know that by comparison, my little story of being a 7-year-old and being awakened is not that big of a deal in sort of the ultimate pain pyramid that someone can go through. And I don't want to belittle other people's pain by sharing this story and by saying that. I guess maybe my point is this. I mentioned the sort of levels of pain because I want you to know that forgiveness is difficult, and I know that there's things you're going through that I have no context for, and I don't totally understand. And you may be sitting there saying, "Well, that's your deal, man, but you'll never believe what happened to me." Fair enough. I don't know, but I know that if you don't work at it, God can't start working, and it's going to be an issue. Flannery O'Connor, to keep the Southern theme going, says, if you don't hunt it down and kill it, it will kill you. And so not forgiving my dad was killing me inside, right? And I set out to fix it, and I got to work, and I started metaphorically tending the soil of my heart. And so what I did was I did what happened this morning and what you guys do here regularly. I just started telling people. And I took a friend, my best friend for my entire life, had no idea. I knew this guy since 2nd grade. And as a 35-year-old man or 33-year-old man, took him to lunch and said, "Hey, heads up, here's what's happened in my life." And that's why I can be a little cranky sometimes. That's why I don't always share what's going on. And this has sort of marked me. And he was awesome about it. And it was a really freeing, idea. You'd be surprised at how gracious people are if you just are honest with them. The second thing I learned is that forgiveness is ongoing. Martin Luther King Jr., who, from what I can tell, was wronged pretty much his entire life, said forgiveness is not an occasional act, it is a permanent attitude. And I think he's echoing Jesus, of course, when he says this. In Matthew 18:21-35, I'm going to read it for us. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Now the thing here is Peter's being a little holier than thou. He's kind of like 7 times sort of thing, because the rabbi's interpretation of the Old Testament was that a person was required to forgive 3 times. So he's kind of saying, hey, look at me, 7 times, is that great or what? And Jesus answered and said, "I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold," it's like billions of dollars, right, "was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me and I will pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went back to their master and told him everything that had happened. The master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." I had a pastor once give a sermon, and he said that we live in a bottomless hole of debt, and we can never pay it all back. That's what Christ did. And so, who am I to not forgive when I've been forgiven of so much? And I think what's interesting is this is a far different thing than our cultural narrative that says, "No, I'm going to get mine. You wronged me, I'm going to wrong you." And I think that's why I like it so much, because it's so different. So when I spent all those years not dealing with what happened, I wasn't forgiving, but more importantly, I wasn't living in the reality that I had been forgiven. And so I claimed to be a Christian, but I was missing out on the best part, which was this complete forgiveness of sins, because I wouldn't forgive my dad. And finally, the third thing I learned as we were winding down here is that grace serves as the reminder of our past, not the pain. When my parents are divorced, and they should have been. But my dad has been healed by Christ. And when he talks about what happened then, he always frames it in the context of what God has done in his life. And so when we talk about the past as a family, we don't talk necessarily about that. We talk about the difference that Christ has made in my dad's life. And I think about the crucifixion, and I don't want to make it sound trite, but wasn't it spectacular? What a spectacular metaphor for forgiveness. They thrust a crown of thorns on his head. They stripped him of his clothes. They spit on him. They beat him. They hung him up like this to die. They put a spear in his side to make sure he was dead. He did all of that to forgive us. And man, that's what forgiveness feels like. It feels like being tortured to death. But if we don't forgive, we can't experience what the cross did for us. And so our lack of forgiveness keeps us from our Heavenly Father. And he asks us to pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And if we let the grace in, what I've learned is that it drowns out all the pain and the hurt, and it's sort of, you're overcome with something other than pain and grief and hurt. You're overcome with love and grace. I mentioned I have 4 kids, and right before we moved, we were playing basketball, me and my dad and the boys, and we were out in the front yard, and this is in Atlanta. And he was kind of bent down because he couldn't take it anymore, and I was kind of, acting like I didn't need to bend down, but I was a little winded too. And I just saw a man there with like banged up knees and a balding head who had made a ton of mistakes in his life. And then every night I go in and I put my hand on my kids before they go to bed, and I think, man, how many mistakes am I going to make? And I just pray for forgiveness for how I've hurt them, and I pray that they'll forgive me. So I know it's not easy, but I imagine the perfect love of the Heavenly Father, and I imagine that this idea that we love because he loved, and in that love we find forgiveness for ourselves and for others. So thanks for having me. Thanks for allowing me to share. I can close in prayer, or you can pray. Right, yeah. Father, what an awesome opportunity we have this morning to come to this restaurant, have eggs and bagels and coffee, and be surrounded by men who in their own way are trying to follow you, Lord, who are trying to be disciples of Christ. And we know we're not perfect in it, and we know that we struggle just like the 12 did, but we know that you want what's best for us. And we know that part of what you want for us is the ability to forgive others, because we've been forgiven of so much. So Lord, as we go about our day and we go about our week, give us a prompting, Lord, just to have an open heart and an open spirit of forgiveness. Help us to see others with empathy, see others the way you see them, and to live in the grace that we have through you. Even harder, Lord, help us to forgive ourselves. Help us to get over the ways that we've wronged other people. Help us to get over the guilt and the shame and the pain that comes with the decisions we've made throughout our life. And help us to operate in the same grace that we're going to extend to other people. Heal our hearts, Lord. Your kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.